Hook, approximately 100 words. At 31,000 feet, a $60 million aircraft was 6 seconds from an unrecoverable dive, and every trained pilot, every senior engineer, every executive in that control tower was completely helpless. Then a voice came through a channel nobody had used in 20 years. Calm, precise, giving instructions that should not have existed. The jet pulled out of the dive. It landed. And when they traced that voice back to its source, they found a man in grease-stained coveralls standing beside a fuel cart on the tarmac. If you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the moment, because this is the kind of story that doesn't let you go. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because nothing about what happened next was simple. The demonstration was supposed to be flawless. That was the word Evelyn Hart had used in her briefing notes 3 times. Flawless. And her assistant Marcus had underlined it without being asked because he understood, better than most, what the word cost her when it wasn't delivered. Evelyn ran Hartwell Aerospace Systems the way her father had run it before the stroke took most of his right side and all of his willingness to sit through board meetings, with controlled intensity and a very short memory for excuses. Today was not a day for excuses. The Meridian 7 was Hartwell's flagship, a twin-engine business jet built around a proprietary fly-by-wire hydraulic system that the Defense Procurement Committee had been circling for 14 months. Today's flight demonstration at Creston Airfield was the thing that would either close the contract or kill it. $42 million annually, renewable, the kind of number that changed what a company was. The guest list reflected that weight. Brigadier General Thomas Rudd sat in the front row of the observation deck with 3 members of his acquisition team, all of them holding coffee they weren't drinking. Beside them, 2 representatives from the Defense Subcommittee, both in civilian clothes that somehow still looked like uniforms. Evelyn stood slightly apart, her jacket pressed, her expression professionally neutral, watching the Meridian 7 taxi toward the runway with the particular focus of someone who has already run the disaster scenarios in their head and decided not to share them. The aircraft was clean. New paint, barely 60 hours of flight time on the airframe. Creston's runway stretched wide and flat under a cloudless October sky, the kind of day that made photographs look overexposed. Everything was right. She noticed the mechanic almost by accident. He was positioned near the south fuel station, about 40 yards from the observation deck, running a pressure check on a ground cart that wasn't connected to anything in particular. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Work shirt faded to a color that used to be blue. The kind of man you categorize without seeing. Airport furniture, background detail. Evelyn's eyes moved past him and back to the runway. The Meridian 7 lifted cleanly. The 2 pilots, Captain Dana Ross and First Officer Kenji Lau, took it up in a slow climbing arc to the north before swinging back for the demonstration passes. At altitude, the aircraft performed exactly as the spec sheets promised. From the ground, it looked effortless. That was the point. The problem started at minute 11. Evelyn saw it before the tower announced it. A slight asymmetry in the roll during the banking turn. A hesitation that didn't belong. She reached for her earpiece before Marcus could tap her arm. In the cockpit, Dana Ross was not having an effortless morning. Hydraulic system 2 is fluctuating, Kenji said, his voice controlled but tight. Pressure cycling, it's not stabilizing. I see it. Dana's hands were already moving. Cross-check your gauges. Both systems now. Dana, both systems are cycling. She tried the manual override. The aircraft acknowledged the input, then ignored it. The fly-by-wire system was doing something it wasn't supposed to do. It was fighting the inputs, subtle at first, then increasingly not subtle. The aileron response lagged. The aircraft began a very slow, very wrong roll to the left. Creston Tower, Meridian 7. We have a hydraulic control anomaly. Request immediate clearance. In the tower, the senior controller, a man named Earl Phelps, who had worked Creston for 19 years, called the anomaly calmly, and then, 30 seconds later, was no longer calm. What the instruments showed him was a control surface degradation happening faster than the standard emergency procedures were designed to address. He was on the phone to Hartwell's flight ops director within 90 seconds. On the observation deck, the atmosphere had changed. It happened the way these things always happen. Not all at once, but in stages, each one slightly worse than the last. First a murmur, then someone's coffee cup being set down very carefully, then General Rudd leaning forward with his forearms on the railing and his acquisition team going quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. "What's happening?" Rudd asked, not loudly. "We're assessing," Evelyn said, which was true and entirely insufficient. Marcus was at her elbow with a radio. The flight ops director was in her ear. The Meridian 7 was visible against the sky, its left wing low by 4 degrees and losing the fight to correct. Dana Ross was good. She was very good. But she was working with a system that had decided, for reasons nobody in the tower or on the ground could yet explain, to stop cooperating. The aircraft was at 9,000 feet and descending in a controlled but worsening spiral when the voice came through. Not through the main tower channel, not through the company frequency. Through a secondary emergency channel, a redundant low-power band that Creston still maintained for historical compliance reasons and that nobody had used in active communication for, by Earl Phelps's later recollection, approximately 18 years. The voice was unhurried. "Meridian 7, this is ground channel Delta 4. Pilots, do not attempt further override inputs. You're fighting the pressure regulator. Listen carefully." In the tower, Earl Phelps stared at his secondary panel. He had in fact forgotten the channel was live. Who is that?" Nobody knew. In the cockpit, Dana Ross made a decision in about 2 seconds. The decision was she had no better options, and the voice sounded like it knew what it was talking about. "Go ahead, Delta 4. Your hydraulic code is running an emergency pressure equalization routine that's locking out pilot override. It was designed for ground maintenance, not flight. Someone pushed it into the flight envelope. Do not fight it. You'll burn out the actuators. Here's what you do." The instructions that followed were specific. Not vague emergency procedure language, not checklist items read from a manual. Specific, sequential, technical. The kind of detail that only comes from knowing the system at an architectural level. Cycle your left thrust reverser deploy switch 3 times in rapid succession. Don't deploy it, just cycle the switch. That trips the maintenance interlock and forces the hydraulic controller to reset. On the reset, you'll have approximately 8 seconds of full manual authority. Use that window to establish level flight and get your airspeed stabilized. After the reset, the system will come back online in degraded mode. That's fine, degraded mode is flyable. Then bring her down. Dana looked at Kenji. Kenji looked back. 3 cycles, she said. 3 cycles, he confirmed. She cycled the switch. There was a pause, 1 second, 2 seconds, and then the aircraft stopped fighting. The controls went light in her hands, genuinely responsive, and she had exactly 8 seconds to do what the voice had told her to do. She used 6 of them. When the system came back up in degraded mode, it was, as promised, flyable. The Meridian 7 landed 11 minutes later. Not gracefully. The degraded hydraulics made the flare rough and the touchdown hard enough to leave marks on the runway. But it landed. Dana Ross held the center line the whole way down. When it stopped rolling and she put the brakes on and the noise faded, she sat in the left seat for a moment and didn't say anything. "Who was that?" Kenji said finally. It wasn't really a question. On the ground, Evelyn was already moving. She crossed the observation deck at a pace that wasn't quite running, came down the stairs, went straight to Earl Phelps, who was standing outside the tower door with an expression like a man who'd just watched a card trick and still wasn't sure how it worked. "That channel," she said. "Find me who was transmitting on it." Phelps was already on his radio. It took 4 minutes. Then he looked at her with a slightly uncertain expression and pointed toward the south fuel station. The mechanic was still there. He was putting his equipment away. Unhurried, methodical. A handheld radio sat on top of the fuel cart, and he was coiling a cable with the automatic patience of someone who has coiled a lot of cables. When Evelyn came around the nose of a parked Citation, and he looked up, his expression didn't change much. He looked like a man who'd been found doing exactly what he'd planned on doing, and had no particular feelings about it. "You?" She stopped 4 feet from him. "That was you." "Yeah," he said. She waited for more. He didn't offer more. How did you know that procedure? She was working to keep her voice level. That reset sequence isn't in any published documentation. That's not in the maintenance manual. It's not in the emergency checklist. It's not anywhere accessible outside of the original development files. He picked up the radio and put it in the cart's storage compartment. I know. That's not an answer. He looked at her for a moment. Up close, he was weathered in the particular way of people who spend a lot of time outdoors doing physical work. Crow's feet around the eyes, hands that were rough at the knuckles. His name tag said Mercer, G, in faded letters. The pilots are okay? He asked. Yes, Evelyn said through some effort. The pilots are okay. I need to know how you knew. Then that's good. He closed the storage compartment. You're going to want to ground that aircraft and pull the hydraulic controller software, not the hardware, so the software. Something's wrong with the equalization routine. Shouldn't be running in flight mode. I know that. I need to know. Ms. Hart. He said her name quietly, like he'd used it before, which he hadn't, in any conversation she could remember. I need to get back to work. We have a Gulfstream coming in at 2. She stared at him. He picked up the fuel cart handle and started walking. She learned his name, Gavin Mercer, from the airport's employee directory in about 4 minutes. She learned his employment history at Creston in about 6. He'd been working ground support and minor maintenance there for just over 3 years. Before that, there was a gap, a substantial one. Before the gap, when she went back further, and she had Marcus pulling every record he could get his hands on by the time she was back in the operations office. Before the gap, there was something she didn't expect. Hartwell Aerospace Systems. A different era. 22 years ago. A division that had been called Advanced Flight Control Systems before it was absorbed and reorganized and its key personnel dispersed in the way that happens when a company decides a project's direction needs to change. Gavin Mercer had been a systems engineer on that team for 7 years. He'd held patents. 3 of them filed jointly with another engineer named Thomas Kessler, who was no longer alive, killed in a test flight incident in 2003 that the investigation board had classified as pilot error. Evelyn had been in college in 2003. She'd heard her father mention the crash once in a way that suggested he didn't want to discuss it further. She looked at Gavin Mercer's personnel file. The photograph was 22 years old. Younger face, shorter hair, same eyes. She looked out the window at the empty South Fuel Station. Then she looked at the date the file was closed, October 14th, 2003. 6 weeks after the crash. He'd resigned without notice. No forwarding address on file. No reference requests. No exit interview. Just gone. The way people go when they're done with something or done with themselves or both. She sat with that for a while. Through the office window, she could see the Meridian 7 on the far end of the ramp, surrounded now by a small crowd of technicians and 2 men in suits from the flight ops team. The aircraft sat there, inert and slightly battered, its hydraulic systems shut down, waiting for someone to figure out what had happened to it. Evelyn understood, in a way she couldn't have articulated precisely to General Rudd or anyone else on the observation deck, that the day had shifted, that whatever she'd walked into Creston Airfield expecting to manage, she was now managing something else entirely. She pulled up the Meridian 7's maintenance logs on her laptop and started reading from the beginning. Outside, the afternoon light was going flat and orange over the runway, and somewhere on the far side of the airfield, Gavin Mercer was checking the oil on a Gulfstream G550 and not thinking about her at all, or at least doing a very convincing impression of it. The debrief with General Rudd lasted 40 minutes and resolved very little. He was professional about it. The military tends to produce men who are professional about near disasters because the alternative is worse, but the questions he left her with were the kind that didn't have good answers yet. Is the aircraft safe? She told him it would be fully inspected before any future flights. Was this an isolated anomaly? She told him they were investigating. Who was the individual who provided the recovery instructions? She paused before answering that one. One of our ground support personnel. Someone with extensive background in the system. Rudd had looked at her in a way that suggested he found this answer interesting rather than reassuring, which was approximately how she'd intended it. After he left, she went back to the files. The 2003 crash had killed Thomas Kessler and the test pilot, a contractor named Reeve Abrams. The investigation board had cited pilot input error during a hydraulic stress test. Kessler and Abrams had been the only two aboard. The aircraft had gone in hard on the third test run, and there had been very little left to examine. Gavin Mercer's name appeared twice in the investigation file, once as the engineer who had filed a pre-test concern report about the hydraulic pressure settings, and once as a witness who had been present on the ground. There was a brief interview summary. He'd said the concern report had been overridden by senior management. The investigator's note beside that summary said, "Claim unsubstantiated, no supporting documentation found." 6 weeks later, he was gone. Evelyn sat with that for a long time. She had grown up in this company. She knew its history the way you know the history of your own house, not in the way you'd find it in records, but in the way you'd find it in certain silences, in the way certain names didn't come up in certain conversations, in the way her father had sometimes looked tired in a way that wasn't about the hour. She was beginning to think she hadn't known the house as well as she thought. Marcus knocked on the door frame. "His shift ends at 5, he said, and he didn't need to specify who. She looked at her watch. 11 minutes. "I'll be at the south gate," she said. He was at the south gate at 4:58, which meant he'd known she was coming. Gavin Mercer had his jacket over one arm and a thermos in his other hand, and he was walking at the same unhurried pace she'd watched him use all afternoon, the pace of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that urgency was a thing other people performed. He saw her leaning against the hood of her car, and he didn't slow down or speed up. He just kept walking until he was close enough to talk without raising his voice. "You went through the employment records," he said. "Of course I did." "How far back?" "Far enough." She straightened up. The evening air at Creston had gone cool and carried the faint smell of jet exhaust that she'd grown up associating with her father's good moods. Gavin Mercer, Systems Engineer, Advanced Flight Control Division, Hartwell Aerospace, 7 years, 3 patents, gone October 14th, 2003. He looked at her without any particular expression. "Okay. That's all you've got? Okay. What do you want me to say?" "I want to know why you're here," she said. "You built that aircraft's control system, or part of it. You hold patents on the hydraulic integration architecture. And for 22 years you've been, what? Working ground support at regional airfields?" "I work on planes," he said. "That's what I do." "You hid." Something moved across his face, not quite irritation, not quite acknowledgement. He looked past her, at the line of hangars going dark in the fading light. "I moved on." The investigation board said Thomas Kessler's crash was pilot error. "I know what the board said. Your pre-test concern report was overridden. Management pressure. You told the investigators the documentation had been removed. The investigator wrote unsubstantiated next to that, in the summary. I read it too." He said it flatly, like a fact, not like a wound, though Evelyn suspected it was both. "You didn't come here to tell me things I already know." "No," she said. "I came here because someone put a maintenance routine into flight operational software on a $60 million aircraft, and that aircraft almost killed 2 people today in front of defense procurement officials, and the only person on this entire airfield who knew how to stop it was a man who hasn't worked for my company in over 2 decades. She paused. "That concerns me." He looked at her then, directly, for a moment that went on a beat longer than comfortable. "It should." She waited. He set the thermos on the roof of her car without asking permission. "Can I see the software logs?" "Excuse me?" "The hydraulic controller. You said you were pulling the software. I want to see the logs." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, as if the reasonableness of the request was self-evident. "If it's what I think it is, you need to know tonight, not next week." Evelyn studied him. 22 years of ground support work had given his face a quality that engineering offices generally didn't. A patience that came from physical labor, from problems that couldn't be argued with, only solved. She was a good judge of people. It was possibly the thing she was best at. She looked at Gavin Mercer and saw someone who was not performing calm. He actually was calm, and that was either reassuring or deeply unnerving depending on what he knew that she didn't. Get in the car, she said. The Hartwell Regional Maintenance Facility was 20 minutes from Creston, a low-slung building that smelled of hydraulic fluid and machine oil and the particular chemical cleanliness of avionics workbenches. The night shift crew had the Meridian 7's hydraulic controller on the bench by the time they arrived, a black box roughly the size of a hardcover novel, connected to a diagnostic laptop running Hartwell's proprietary analysis software. The lead technician on duty was a woman named Priya Okafor, 31, who had the specific energy of someone who had been looking forward to a quiet Thursday evening and was revising that expectation in real time. She looked at Gavin, then at Evelyn, then back at Gavin. "He's with me," Evelyn said. Priya moved aside without comment, which Evelyn appreciated. Gavin sat down at the workbench. He didn't ask for permission to touch anything. He put on a pair of gloves from the dispenser on the wall and pulled the diagnostic laptop toward him and looked at the log output for a long moment, scrolling slowly, not rapidly, the way people scroll when they're actually reading rather than searching. The log was about 800 lines. He read through roughly the first 200, then stopped. "There," he said. Priya leaned over. "The pressure equalization subroutine? That subroutine is not supposed to exist in the flight software package." He didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way you'd say a door was unlocked that should have been locked. "That's a ground maintenance function. It was written to run only when the aircraft is stationary and connected to ground power. Someone moved it into the flight envelope and changed the trigger conditions." "Changed them to what?" Evelyn asked. "To a hydraulic load threshold, meaning if the pilots pushed the system hard enough during a demanding maneuver, like, say, a banking demonstration pass in front of defense officials, the routine would activate." He paused. "It would look like a hydraulic anomaly, unpredictable, difficult to reproduce, almost impossible to trace without knowing exactly what you were looking for." The room was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Almost," Evelyn said. "Almost." He stood up from the bench. "You need to look at the software version history. When was the last build pushed to this controller?" Priya was already pulling it up. Her face changed as she read the timestamp. 6 weeks ago. That's after the final pre-delivery inspection. This unit was cleared and certified, and then someone pushed a software update after certification." "Who has access to push updates to flight controller software after certification?" Gavin asked, looking at Evelyn. She didn't answer immediately, because the answer had implications she needed a moment to look at from multiple angles. Maintenance authorization requires a department head sign-off. For post-certification software, it requires COO approval. Gavin looked at her without saying anything. "There are 12 people in this company with COO-level system access," she said. "Victor Sloan is one of them." "I know who Victor Sloan is. He's been COO for 9 years. He came up through the avionics division. My father trusted him completely." She heard herself saying it and recognized the specific flatness in her own voice, the sound of a fact that has just become complicated. "You think this is connected to the 2003 crash? I think the equalization subroutine in this controller is structurally identical to a piece of code that was in Thomas Kessler's test aircraft." He said it carefully, like he'd been thinking about how to say it for a while. "The same logic, the same trigger architecture. The difference is 22 years of better obfuscation." Priya had gone very still at the workbench. "Tom found it," Gavin said. 3 days before the crash. He came to me at... It was late. I remember it was late. We were the last ones in the lab. He said he'd found something in the test software that didn't match the approved build. A subroutine that shouldn't have been there, buried 3 layers deep in the pressure management code. He stopped. Looked at the controller on the bench. I told him to document it and we'd take it to the division head in the morning. And the next morning he was dead. The aircraft went in on the 3rd hydraulic stress run, and Tom was aboard because he'd pushed to be there personally. He wanted to observe the subroutine behavior in flight. I didn't know that until after." Evelyn sat down on a stool, not because she was tired, because the shape of what she was hearing required sitting down. "You filed the concern report," she said. "After. I filed it that afternoon, before the investigation team had even finished at the crash site." His jaw tightened slightly. Within 48 hours, the concern report had been logged and the documentation Tom had compiled, his notes, his screenshots, his code comparisons, was gone, flagged as superseded by the certified build. The investigation board got the clean version of the software logs. He picked up his thermos. I had nothing left to show them. Just my word, and the word of a dead engineer doesn't count for much when the board is already leaning toward pilot error. The fluorescent light buzzed. Outside the building, a jet was taxiing somewhere on the field, its engine a low, receding moan. "Why didn't you leave documentation somewhere?" Evelyn asked. She wasn't accusing, she was trying to understand. He looked at her. "I was 29 years old. I'd been in that division for 7 years. Thomas Kessler was my best friend, and he was in the ground in pieces, and the company was telling me his notes didn't exist, and the investigator was writing unsubstantiated next to everything I said." He paused. "I made copies of what I had, took them home, and then I spent about 6 months trying to decide what to do with them, and by then it didn't matter because the investigation was closed and the findings were final, and I was standing in the parking lot of a Hartwell facility in the middle of nowhere realizing that I'd stayed too long, hoping something would change." "You still have the copies," Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. He would have said so if he didn't. "Yeah," he said. "I have them." Bet. She drove him back to his truck at Creston, and they sat in the parking lot for a while because neither of them was quite ready to end the conversation. The field was dark now, except for the perimeter lights and the glow of the tower cab. And the only aircraft moving was a small piston single on a night training flight, its strobe light blinking steadily against the black. 22 years, Evelyn said. "You could have come forward at any point." "To who?" he asked, not unkindly. "Your father was running the company. Whatever happened in 2003, it happened on his watch. I didn't know how deep it went." "You thought he knew?" "I thought he might have. I wasn't sure. Your father was a complicated man." He said it carefully. "He cared about the engineering. I believe that. Whether he cared about it more than he cared about the contract, I couldn't tell you." Evelyn looked at the windshield. Her father had been in the hospital 4 months ago for a follow-up on his stroke recovery, and she'd sat beside his bed for 3 hours watching him sleep, and she'd thought about the company and what she was building and what he'd built and whether those were the same thing. She thought about it differently now. "What changed?" she asked. "Why take the job at Creston?" Gavin was quiet for a moment. "The Meridian 7 contract came out 18 months ago. The procurement announcement. I saw it in an industry newsletter." He turned the thermos in his hands. "Same company, same hydraulic architecture. I recognized it from the patent citations. New aircraft, same core system. And I thought, if the same people are still there, if the same patterns are there, and if something goes wrong, someone needs to know what to look for." He shrugged, a small, uncomfortable movement. "So I got a job at the closest field to where I figured the demonstration flight would happen. Took me a while to get it. I'm not exactly a young guy with fresh credentials." She looked at him. "You've been waiting here for 18 months for today." "More or less." She stopped herself from saying what she was going to say, which was insane, because it wasn't insane. It was the kind of thing a person does when they've been carrying something for 22 years and have finally found a context in which to set it down. "Did you know it would happen today? The failure?" "No. I didn't know if it would happen at all. Maybe I was wrong about the whole thing." He looked out the side window. "I was on the radio before the aircraft even took off, running my own diagnostic on the secondary channel, looking for anything. When I saw the flight data through the tower's broadcast, the hydraulic pressure fluctuation, I knew." She tried to imagine what that moment had been like for him. Sitting beside a fuel cart for 18 months, waiting for something she'd hoped wouldn't happen, watching it happen anyway. "You saved those pilots," she said. He didn't respond to that. "Gavin, you saved them." "Tom Kessler didn't get saved," he said, and that was the end of that particular conversation. Marcus had the full historical records waiting for her when she got back to the office. She'd asked him to dig, and Marcus dug with the methodical thoroughness of a man who understood that asking him to dig meant she actually needed what was buried, not just confirmation that something was there. What was there was not small. Victor Sloan had joined Hartwell in 1999, 4 years before the crash. He'd come from a defense avionics firm called Redstone Systems Group, which Evelyn's research turned up as a subsidiary of a larger defense contractor with federal contracts in 3 countries. She hadn't known this. It wasn't a secret exactly, but it was the kind of thing that didn't come up in board meetings. The 2003 crash had killed 2 people and effectively ended the Advanced Flight Control Division's independent development track. The technology had been absorbed into the main avionics department, Victor's department, as of his promotion to VP of Avionics Systems in early 2004, 6 months after the investigation closed. The patents Gavin and Kessler had filed had been reassigned to the company in the standard post-employment process. The hydraulic integration architecture that had been Gavin Mercer's work was now, on paper, Hartwell's IP, and it had been developed into the Meridian 7's core system under Victor's oversight. She sat with that for a long time. There was a knock at the office door. "Come in," she said, expecting Marcus. It was Priya Okafor. She'd driven over from the maintenance facility without calling ahead, which was either confidence or urgency, and her expression suggested urgency. "I kept looking at the logs," Priya said. She had a tablet in her hand and she held it up. "The software push 6 weeks ago. I tracked the access credentials. The authorization came through the COO system access portal, but the terminal it was pushed from..." She turned the tablet toward Evelyn. "It's a maintenance subnet terminal. We have 3 of them. One at this facility, one at the Hartwell Tech Center, and one at the avionics lab in Building C." "Building C," Evelyn said. "That's secure access." "Yes, senior engineering and executive staff only. I ran the badge log for the day of the push." Priya set the tablet on the desk. Victor Sloan badged into Building C at 6:47 in the evening. He was the only authorized user in that building between 6 and 9 p.m. Evelyn looked at the badge log on the tablet screen. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the authorization signature on the software push, which she'd seen before and had processed as a routine executive approval and now understood was something else entirely. "Does anyone else have this?" she asked. "Just you. I haven't sent it anywhere." "Don't. Not yet." She looked at Priya. "Are you okay?" Priya made a face that was somewhere between exhausted and wired. "I've been staring at hydraulic code logs for 4 hours, and I just figured out that someone may have deliberately tried to crash one of our aircraft. So no, not particularly." "Go home. Get some sleep. Don't talk to anyone about this, not your shift supervisor, not your colleagues, nobody." She held Priya's gaze until the younger woman nodded. "I mean it." After Priya left, Evelyn sat alone in the office with the tablet and the records and the particular quality of silence that comes when a building is mostly empty and the thing you've been looking at for the last 2 hours is bigger than you expected. She pulled up Victor Sloan's contact file. His office number, his mobile, his assistant's line. 9 years as her COO. She'd promoted him herself when the previous COO retired. She'd trusted his judgment on 6 major contract decisions. She'd had him to her home for the company Christmas dinner. He'd shaken her father's hand at the facility opening 3 years ago, and her father had smiled, and she'd taken a photograph. She closed the file without calling him. She called Gavin instead, at 11:15 at night, from the parking lot of the office building. The phone rang 4 times, and she was composing what she'd say to voicemail when he picked up. "You're still awake," she said. "Never really got to sleep," he said. His voice was the same as it was in person, unhurried, no performance. She could hear the faint sound of something in the background, maybe a television on low. "We have the badge logs," she said, "and the terminal records. Victor Sloan pushed that software update himself, 6 weeks ago, alone in Building C." A pause. Not surprise exactly, more like the specific weight of having suspected something for a long time and having it confirmed. "Okay," he said. "That's your word, apparently." "It's a useful word." She leaned against the car. The parking lot was empty, the overhead lights buzzing in the cool air. "What do we do with this?" "We need an independent forensic review of the software," he said. "Someone who can compare the subroutine structure in the Meridian 7 controller against the 2003 test aircraft's documented software. If the architecture matches the way I think it does, that's not coincidence, that's authorship. You have the 2003 documentation. I have what Tom compiled. It's enough. Who does the forensic review? I can't use our internal software team. If Victor has been operating inside this company for 22 years, I don't know who else might be involved or who might report back to him. She heard herself saying it and registered the specific disorientation of distrusting your own institution. I need someone outside. I know someone, Gavin said. He's not cheap and he's not fast, but he's independent and he's been doing avionics software forensics for 15 years. His name is Derek Falk. He did work for the NTSB on 2 investigations. Can you reach him? Tonight? No. Tomorrow morning, yes. Do it. She pushed off the car. And Gavin, she stopped. The question she wanted to ask was complicated, and she wasn't sure she'd get an honest answer, and she wasn't sure an honest answer would help. But she asked it anyway. Did my father know? About the 2003 crash, about what really happened? The pause this time was longer, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. I don't know, he said finally. I've asked myself that for 22 years. I think he might have known the investigation findings weren't complete. Whether he knew why or who was responsible, I can't tell you. He didn't strike me as someone who would deliberately cover a murder. A beat. But he was also someone who could convince himself of things if it was easier. She thought about her father's face, the way it looked when he was tired, the way he'd changed the subject once when she'd asked about the 2003 crash at dinner, maybe 5 years ago. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. Get some sleep, she said. I'll see you tomorrow. She hung up and stood in the empty parking lot for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then she got in the car and drove home. She didn't sleep much. She lay in the dark and went over what she knew. In the order she knew it, which is a thing she'd always done when a problem was too large to approach directly. She'd walk around its edges, look at it from different angles, try to find the shape of it before she tried to move it. What she knew, someone had modified the Meridian 7's hydraulic software after certification in a way designed to cause a control failure under specific flight conditions. The access trail led to Victor Sloan. The modification technique was structurally similar to what had been found by a dead engineer 22 years ago in a test aircraft that subsequently crashed and killed 2 people. Gavin Mercer had seen it both times. He was the only living person who had. What she didn't know, whether Victor was operating alone, whether there were others in the company involved or others outside it, what the motivation was, corporate espionage, a competing contractor, something else, whether there was more she hadn't found yet. She thought about General Rudd and his acquisition team. She thought about what it meant for the defense contract. She thought about the Meridian 7 sitting in the maintenance hangar with its systems open. And she thought about Priya Okafor driving home through the dark with something she'd been told not to tell anyone. She thought about a young software engineer named Thomas Kessler, who had found something in a code base 22 years ago and told his best friend about it and been dead 72 hours later. She turned on the light at 2 in the morning and sent Marcus a single text. Pull every access log, every software authorization, every system entry associated with Victor Sloan going back 3 years. Everything. Don't tell anyone why. Marcus responded 4 minutes later with, already started. She turned the light off again. It occurred to her lying there in the dark that she hadn't asked Gavin where he'd kept the copies of Tom Kessler's documentation for 22 years. It occurred to her that it mattered. That those documents were, at this moment, the most important objects in whatever the situation was becoming, and they were in the possession of a man she'd met 8 hours ago who worked a ground support job at a regional airfield and said, okay, the way other people said entire paragraphs. She trusted him. She didn't entirely understand why, but she did. Maybe because he'd had 22 years to do something with what he knew, and had chosen instead to wait for a moment when it would count. Maybe because a man who'd stayed silent for 2 decades out of caution was less likely to do something reckless now. Maybe because the pilots of the Meridian 7 were alive tonight, and that was because of him. And she couldn't argue with that particular fact no matter what else was uncertain. She closed her eyes and eventually slept for a few hours and dreamed about something else entirely, which was probably just her brain being merciful. Gavin reached Derek Falk at 7:40 in the morning. She knew because he texted her. Falk is available, wants to see both sets of logs, can be here by Friday. She texted back, tell him to come Thursday. I'll pay the rush fee. By 9 a.m., she was at the maintenance facility with Marcus, going through 3 years of Victor Sloan's system access records with the specific attention she usually reserved for contract negotiations. The kind of attention that looks for what's not there as much as what is. Marcus had printed everything, which was 47 pages, and they spread it across the conference table and worked through it methodically, which was not glamorous and took 4 hours and produced 2 things of significance. The first was that Victor had accessed the avionics software repository on 9 separate occasions over the past 18 months, always after business hours, always alone, always from Building C. That wasn't evidence of wrongdoing by itself. COOs accessed systems after hours, but 9 times, specifically the avionics repository, specifically Building C, specifically no co-signatory on any of the sessions, was a pattern that didn't fit Victor's stated responsibilities. The second was a discrepancy in the certification records. The Meridian 7's hydraulic controller had been certified with software build 4.1.7. The unit that had been on the aircraft this morning was running 4.1.9. The version change documentation showed a routine patch, approved under Victor's standing authorization, logged as a minor telemetry update. There was no independent review. There was no cosign from the Flight Safety Department. It had been processed as administrative, which meant it had bypassed the standard safety review chain entirely. Evelyn sat back in her chair and looked at Marcus, who had the expression of a man who was good at his job and was finding the consequences of that less satisfying than usual. He used the administrative track to push a safety-critical update, she said. Yes, Marcus said, and the system allowed it. The system has a gap. Post-certification minor updates under COO authorization route through admin, not safety review. It's been in the process documentation since 2018. He paused. Victor helped write that process documentation. She thought about that. 9 years. He'd had 9 years to learn the architecture of the company's internal systems and find the gaps in the oversight structure and put himself in exactly the position he needed to be in to do something like this without anyone noticing. That level of patience and planning was either impressive or horrifying. Evelyn found it both. She thought about her father shaking his hand at the facility opening. Get me a meeting with the board, she said. Friday morning. Don't tell them what it's about. Just tell them it's urgent. She stood up. And call security. I want Building C access suspended for everyone except flight safety staff until further notice. Do it quietly. Victor will notice, Marcus said. I know. She picked up her jacket. I'm counting on it. Victor Sloan called her at 8:47 Thursday morning. She was in her car in the Hartwell parking structure and, engine off, going through Derek Falk's preliminary findings on her laptop when the phone buzzed. She looked at his name on the screen for 2 full rings before she answered. Victor, she said. Evelyn. His voice was what it always was, measured, confident, the voice of a man accustomed to being the steadiest person in any room. I heard about the Building C access suspension. Marcus said it came from you. It did. Can I ask why? I have 3 software teams that work out of that building. I'm getting calls. She had thought about this moment since Tuesday night, lying in the dark, running through the edges of what she knew. She had decided that the version of herself who confronted Victor Sloan before she had everything in order was the version who lost. Flight safety protocol, she said. After Tuesday's incident, I want independent review of all recent avionics software modifications before anyone touches those systems again. It's temporary. A pause. Brief, professional, the kind of pause that could be interpreted as reasonable consideration. That seems excessive for what was preliminarily classified as a hydraulic anomaly. It does, doesn't it? She said. I'll let you know when the review is complete. She ended the call before he could respond, which was rude, and she was fine with that. Falk had arrived Wednesday evening, a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and carried a forensic toolkit that looked like a fishing tackle box. He'd set up in the maintenance conference room and worked through the night, which Evelyn hadn't asked him to do and which he'd done anyway, apparently because that was how he approached things. By Thursday morning, he had 40 pages of preliminary analysis and a very specific expression when he handed them to her. I need to ask you something before we get into this, he said. Go ahead. Have you contacted federal authorities yet? She looked at him. Not yet. Falk nodded slowly. After you read what I found, you'll understand why I'm asking. He sat down across from her. The short version is this. The subroutine embedded in the Meridian 7's hydraulic controller is not a modification. It's a transplant. The code architecture, SAS, the specific logic structure, the variable naming convention, the way the pressure threshold triggers are written, is identical to a body of code that doesn't belong to any of Hartwell's documented development branches. It matches the 2003 documentation, Evelyn said. It matches the 2003 documentation Gavin Mercer provided, yes, but it also matches something else. He opened his laptop and turned it toward her. I ran a comparative analysis against a software repository that was disclosed in a federal civil case in 2019. A defense contractor called Meridian Avionics Group filed suit against another firm for code theft. The disputed code was an embedded pressure management subroutine for fly-by-wire hydraulic systems. He tapped the screen. The code in the Meridian 7 controller is a modified version of the code at the center of that dispute. Evelyn looked at the comparison on the screen. She understood software analysis at a functional level, enough to follow what Falk was showing her. The structural resemblance was not subtle. Meridian Avionics Group, she said. Our aircraft is called the Meridian 7. I noticed that. That's not a coincidence. No, Falk said. I don't think it is. She sat back. The pieces were there, and the shape they made when you arranged them was uglier than she'd anticipated. Victor Sloan had come from Redstone Systems Group, a subsidiary of a larger defense contractor network. Meridian Avionics Group, the Meridian 7. 22 years of patient, careful positioning inside a company that held the patents to hydraulic integration architecture that someone else had wanted badly enough to arrange a crash for. The crash in 2003 hadn't just been about killing a safety concern, it had been about acquiring the technology. And the Meridian 7 demonstration hadn't been about sabotaging a defense contract, it had been about something else, something she didn't have the full shape of yet. I need Gavin in this room, she said. He came in 40 minutes later, still in his work clothes from the morning shift at Creston, which he'd apparently walked off without explanation. He sat down next to Falk, read the preliminary report in 12 minutes without commenting, and then looked up. The civil case, he said to Falk. 2019, Meridian Avionics versus Castleford Defense Systems? Falk looked at him with the specific expression of someone recalibrating an assumption. You know it. I followed it. I followed everything I could find that touched hydraulic fly-by-wire patent disputes. Gavin set the report down. Castleford lost the case, but the court found the code evidence insufficient for criminal referral. The disputed subroutine was ruled independently developed. He paused. But it wasn't independently developed. Tom and I wrote the foundational architecture in 2001. Someone took it, modified it, and sold it to Castleford, and then planted a version back into our own aircraft. Why? Evelyn said. If they already had the code? Because the patents are still ours. Were still ours. Gavin looked at her. If the Meridian 7 had crashed on Tuesday, catastrophic hydraulic failure in front of defense officials, the contract would have been pulled. The subsequent investigation would have found the subroutine. It would have looked like Hartwell's own code had a fatal flaw. The patents become worthless, the company's reputation is destroyed, and whoever holds the competing architecture moves into the space you leave behind. The room was quiet. They're not trying to steal the contract, Evelyn said. They're trying to collapse us so the field opens up. And they've been working toward it since 2003. He said it without heat. Just the weight of the thing, stated plainly. Tom figured out the original code theft. That's what he found in the test software. Not just the dangerous subroutine, but evidence that the architecture had been copied. Someone found out he knew, and they made sure he didn't live to document it properly. Falk had been listening with his hands folded on the table. You're describing premeditated murder. Yes, Gavin said. I am. The word sat in the room. Murder. It was the right word and they all knew it, and knowing it was the right word didn't make it easier to have said out loud. Evelyn looked at Falk. How long to complete your full forensic analysis? Full documentation, chain of evidence, quality, 48 hours. You have 36. She stood up. I have a board meeting tomorrow morning, and I need it to be complete before I walk into that room. She looked at Gavin. The documents you kept. Tom Kessler's originals. I need them here by this afternoon. He nodded. I'll drive up and get them. How far? About 90 minutes. He stood. I kept them in a safe deposit box in a bank 2 towns over. Didn't want them anywhere I was living. He said it matter-of-factly, but there was something in it. 22 years of carrying something valuable and fragile, keeping it a careful distance away, close enough to matter, but not close enough to lose. She watched him pick up his jacket. Gavin. He looked back. Thank you. For all of it. She meant it, and she thought he could tell she meant it, and she thought it made him uncomfortable in the way that genuine gratitude sometimes makes people uncomfortable when they've been operating for a long time without much of it. Get through the board meeting first, he said, and left. Victor appeared at her office door at 2 in the afternoon. She'd known he would. Building C access suspension. No explanation. A board meeting called for Friday morning. She'd been counting on it pulling him toward her, and it had. She looked up from her desk and he was standing in the doorway in one of his good suits, his expression arranged into something that read as concerned collegiality. You have a minute? He said. Sure. She didn't gesture to the chair. He sat anyway. Victor Sloan was 61, trim, gray at the temples in a way that photographic well. He had a quality that Evelyn had always characterized as still, not passive, but conserved, like someone who never spent energy he didn't need to spend. She'd read it as competence for 9 years. She was reading it differently now. The board meeting, he said. Marcus isn't telling me the agenda. It's an executive session. He held her gaze. I'm the COO, Evelyn. I know what you are. Something shifted, very slightly, in his expression. If she hadn't been watching for it, she might have missed it. A micro-adjustment, a fraction of a recalibration. He was smart. She'd always known he was smart. Smart enough to understand that what she'd just said was not a normal response. Is there something I should know about? He asked. His voice stayed even. I'm still gathering information, she said. When I have what I need, you'll know what I know. That was true, she thought. He would find out what she knew at exactly the same time as the board of directors, the Defense Department officials she'd already quietly called, and the 2 federal investigators Marcus had been in contact with since Wednesday afternoon, who were currently sitting in a rental car in the visitor parking lot and had been for the past 3 hours. Victor looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up, smoothed his jacket. The Meridian 7 incident, he said. I want to make sure we're handling the narrative carefully with Rudd's team. One bad demonstration shouldn't sink a 4-year relationship. I agree, she said. We should be very careful about the narrative. He left. She listened to his footsteps down the hallway, even and unhurried, and she thought about a man who had been sitting inside this company for over 2 decades, learning its systems, building its trust, waiting with the particular patience of someone who has a very long game and doesn't mind playing it. 9 years as COO. Before that, 6 years in avionics. Before that, Redstone Systems Group. Before that, she was still pulling threads on what came before. She thought about Thomas Kessler, 26 years old in 2003, according to the personnel file. She'd looked him up after Gavin had mentioned him, a proper look, not just the name in an investigation record. He'd been from Wisconsin. He'd had a sister. He'd played guitar badly, according to a feature piece from an engineering school alumni magazine that had mentioned him in a tribute section the year after the crash. He'd been the kind of engineer who wrote comments in his code that were funnier than they needed to be. He'd found something he shouldn't have found, and he told the wrong person about it, or the right person had overheard, or something. She didn't know exactly how it had happened, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But 22 years later, his documentation was in a safe deposit box 90 minutes away, and tomorrow morning it was going to matter. She opened her laptop and started drafting her presentation for the board. Gavin came back at 4:30 with a manila envelope that was soft at the corners from handling and age, the kind of envelope that has been picked up and set down enough times that it carries the history of its own importance. He set it on the conference room table and Falk opened it with the careful attention of someone who understood chain of evidence, photographed each page before touching it, and then read through Kessler's original documentation in the specific, focused silence of a man assembling a structural argument. Gavin sat across the table and drank bad coffee from the machine in the hallway and didn't say much, which Evelyn was learning was his natural state when there was nothing useful to add. "This is good," Falk said, after about 40 minutes. The variable naming convention in Kessler's documentation matches what's in the current controller. It's not just architectural similarity, it's the same author. He looked up. This establishes that the subroutine in the Meridian 7 traces back to code that was present in the 2003 test aircraft. Combined with the Castleford case filings and the access logs, we have a documented chain. "Is it enough?" Evelyn asked. "For the board meeting? Yes. For federal prosecution?" He made a measured gesture. "It's strong. Whether it's enough depends on what the investigators find when they start pulling Victor Sloan's communications and financial records." She thought about the two federal investigators in the parking lot. She'd spoken to them briefly Wednesday afternoon through an intermediary, a former law school acquaintance who now worked in federal aerospace oversight. And they had been cautious and specific in the way that federal investigators are when they're genuinely interested but not yet committed. They'd asked good questions. They'd asked about the Castleford case, which had told her they already had threads they were pulling from their own direction. She hadn't told Victor any of this. She'd told Victor nothing that wasn't already implied by the building access suspension and the board meeting, which was enough to make him careful, but not enough to make him run, which was the balance she'd been trying to strike. "What time tomorrow?" Gavin asked. She looked at him. 9 a.m. Board convenes at 9. She paused. "I'd like you there." He shook his head slowly. "That's a board meeting. I'm a mechanic. You're the person who can explain the technical evidence when the board members ask questions I can't answer, and they'll ask questions." She looked at him steadily. "You said you kept those documents for 22 years waiting for a moment when they'd count. This is the moment." He looked at the envelope on the table. She could see him thinking it through, not nervously, not dramatically, just turning it over with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. "Victor will be there he said. "COO level, he'll be in that meeting." "Yes." "And I'm the evidence, essentially, me and those documents." "You're one part of it. Falk's analysis is the other part. The access logs are the third." She leaned forward. "Victor doesn't know about you. He doesn't know I found you. He doesn't know what you have. He doesn't know you can identify the code architecture because you wrote it. That's not a small advantage." Gavin was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "What time do you need me there?" 8:30. He nodded. That was all. But the board meeting was in the top floor conference room, which had glass walls on 3 sides and a view of the airfield that on clear mornings was genuinely striking, the kind of corporate architecture that wanted you to feel the scale of what you were managing. The table seated 16. The 8 board members arrived between 8:50 and 9:10, with the variability that suggested some of them had been told more than others about what to expect. General Rudd and 2 members of his acquisition team were seated along the east wall at a smaller table, present by Evelyn's specific invitation, which she'd extended Wednesday evening and which Rudd had accepted without asking many questions, which she took as a sign that he had his own reasons for wanting to be in the room. Victor arrived at 9:03. He saw Rudd first, and something moved through his face. A rapid, controlled adjustment, there and gone in under 2 seconds. Then he saw Gavin, standing near the wall beside Falk, and the adjustment happened again, slower this time, harder to complete. He sat down at his usual position, 2 seats to Evelyn's right. He opened his notebook. He uncapped his pen. He did all the things a man does when he has decided that the most important thing he can do right now is look exactly like himself. Evelyn opened the meeting without preamble. Tuesday's flight demonstration produced a hydraulic control failure that nearly killed 2 pilots in front of federal acquisition officials, she said. "I told General Rudd we were investigating. This is what we found." She nodded to Falk. He was good at this, she'd wondered, but he was good at it. He had the ability to translate extremely technical information into language that non-engineers could follow without condescending to anyone, which was rarer than it should have been. He walked the board through the software analysis methodically. The unauthorized update, the embedded subroutine, the structural match to the 2003 documentation, the comparison with the Castleford case code repository. He used a projected display and pointed at specific lines of code without reading them aloud, which kept the pace moving. He was precise, and he wasn't theatrical, and the room got very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with boredom. When Falk finished, Evelyn pulled up the access logs. The software update that embedded this subroutine in the Meridian 7's hydraulic controller was pushed 6 weeks ago from a terminal in Building C, she said. The terminal session was authenticated using COO-level system credentials. The Building C badge log shows one authorized user in the building during the window of the push. She put Victor's name on the screen, just his name and the timestamp and the terminal ID. The room did the thing rooms do when something significant has been said plainly and without decoration. It took a breath. Board members looked at the screen. 3 of them looked at Victor. Rudd looked at Evelyn with an expression that was difficult to read, but not, she thought, entirely surprised. Victor put his pen down. "That's a serious allegation," he said, "based on an access log." Based on an access log, a forensic code analysis, a chain of documentation going back to 2003, and a comparison with code at the center of a federal civil dispute. She kept her voice level. "I'm not making an allegation, I'm presenting evidence. The access log shows I was in the building. It doesn't show what I was doing." "The terminal session log does," Falk said from his position by the wall. "The session authenticated under your credentials pushed build 4.1.9 to the Meridian 7 controller. The session log is in the evidence package each board member has in front of them, page 23. Papers rustled. "I want to introduce one more piece of evidence," Evelyn said, "and then I'm going to ask the gentleman by the wall to explain what it means." She looked at Gavin. He came forward to the table without hurry, sat down across from Victor. He had the manila envelope with him. He opened it and put Kessler's documentation on the table in front of Falk, who began distributing the photographed copies that had been printed that morning. Victor looked at the documents. He looked at Gavin. Something happened in his face that was not quite recognition and not quite fear, but was somewhere in between. The expression of a man who has just identified a variable he believed he had eliminated 22 years ago and is now doing very rapid internal calculations. "My name is Gavin Mercer," Gavin said. He said it to the room, not specifically to Victor. "I was a systems engineer in Hartwell's Advanced Flight Control Division from 1996 to 2003. I hold 3 patents on the hydraulic integration architecture that became the core of the Meridian 7's flight control system." He put his hand on the documents. "These are the original research notes compiled by Thomas Kessler in the week before his death in 2003. Tom found an unauthorized subroutine embedded in the test aircraft software. He documented it. He died before the investigation could be opened. The investigation was closed as pilot error." He looked directly at Victor. "The subroutine Tom documented in 2003 and the subroutine Derek Falk found in the Meridian 7 controller this week were written by the same person, using the same architectural logic. I can explain how I know that in as much technical detail as you'd like." A board member named Howard Ching, who had been on Hartwell's board for 11 years and had a background in finance and not engineering, said very carefully, "Are you saying the 2003 crash was not pilot error?" "I'm saying the pilot didn't cause the crash," Gavin said. The room absorbed this. Victor spoke. His voice was still controlled, but it had changed in a way that Evelyn caught, a tightness that hadn't been there before, the sound of a man who has been running a very long distance and can feel the ground changing under him. "This is an extraordinary claim based on 22-year-old documents from a source who left the company under unclear circumstances and has spent 2 decades working airport ground support. I think we need to be careful about—" "Victor," Evelyn said his name quietly, and something in the way she said it cut through the rest of the sentence. He stopped. She looked at him across the table, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not anger exactly, but the specific cold clarity that comes when something you've been trying not to see becomes impossible not to see. The federal investigators in the building right now have a warrant for your communications records, your financial records, and your access logs going back 10 years. They're going to find what they find. I can't stop that, and I don't want to." The silence this time was a different kind, longer, heavier. Victor's face went through something complicated. The stillness that she'd read as competence for 9 years tried to hold, and then, in a way that was painful to watch, even given everything, stopped holding. Not dramatically. He didn't collapse, didn't put his face in his hands, didn't perform anything. He just became, very suddenly, a man who had run out of the thing that had been sustaining him. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Gavin. He looked at his own hands. "I want my attorney," he said. "That's your right," Evelyn said. "There are federal agents outside this room. They've been waiting." She looked at Marcus, who was standing by the door. Marcus opened it. "Bus." The two investigators came in and the room reorganized itself the way rooms do when authority of a specific kind enters. Everyone who didn't need to be there found reasons to create space, and the people who did need to be there stayed and did what they were supposed to do. Victor stood when they asked him to stand. He didn't say anything further. He was professional about it, which under other circumstances might have been a quality she respected. He walked out of the conference room at 9:47 a.m. with his jacket still on and his notebook still on the table, and that was the last time Evelyn Hart saw Victor Sloan as her COO or as anything else she'd understood him to be. The room stayed quiet for a moment after he left. General Rudd was looking at the airfield through the glass wall, his arms crossed, his acquisition team behind him in a row. Board members were looking at their copies of the evidence package with the specific expression of people recalibrating a large number of assumptions simultaneously. Rudd turned from the window. "Ms. Hart," he said, "I want to understand something. The man who identified the subroutine in the Meridian 7 and guided the pilots to safety, that's the same man sitting at your table." "Yes," she said. Rudd looked at Gavin for a moment. Gavin looked back without particular expression. "And where has he been for 22 years?" "Waiting," Evelyn said. "For the right moment." Rudd nodded slowly, with the manner of a man who has served long enough to understand that some situations don't resolve cleanly, they resolve correctly, and the difference matters. He looked at the evidence package. He looked at Evelyn. "I think we have a significant amount to discuss about the path forward with this contract," he said. "But not today." "Agreed," she said. "Not today." Howard Ching had his reading glasses off and was rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Evelyn," he said, "your father—" "I know," she said. "I'll deal with that separately." She didn't say anything else about it, and Ching, who had been on the board long enough to read the things Evelyn didn't elaborate on, didn't push further. After the room cleared, and it took a while because things that need to be said in the margins of moments like this tend to take time, Evelyn found herself standing at the glass wall looking at the airfield. She could see the maintenance hangar from here, and the Meridian 7 still in it, its systems open, its recovery underway in the careful, methodical way of all things that have been damaged and need to be examined before they can fly again. Gavin was behind her, putting the manila envelope back together with the care of someone returning something to a place it had lived for a long time. She watched his reflection in the glass. "It's over," she said. Not triumphantly, just as a fact. "This part," he said. She turned around. He was right, obviously. There was a federal investigation to cooperate with, a company to stabilize, a board to manage, a defense contract relationship to repair, an aircraft to certify. There was her father whom she'd need to call, and that conversation had a shape she couldn't yet see clearly. There was the question of who else at Hartwell had known or suspected, and who at Redstone and Castleford and wherever else this thread ran was going to be pulled into the light when the investigators started working outward from Victor Sloan. There was Thomas Kessler's family, somewhere in Wisconsin, who deserved to know that the finding of pilot error was not what had actually happened to their son and brother. None of that was small. None of it was quick. But Victor was in federal custody, and the evidence was documented, and the aircraft was grounded, and the pilots were alive, and Gavin Mercer was standing in her conference room with 22-year-old documents in a soft-cornered envelope, and she thought, this part is over. Get some coffee, she said. We have a lot of work to do. He picked up the envelope. Yeah, he said. We do. The federal investigation didn't move fast. That was the first thing Evelyn had to adjust to. She'd understood intellectually that these things took time, that the distance between a man walking out of a conference room in federal custody and a complete accounting of what he'd done was measured in months, not days. But understanding something intellectually and living inside it were different. The weeks after Victor's arrest had a specific quality she hadn't anticipated, not resolution, but suspension. The company kept running. People came to work, contracts got managed, aircraft got serviced, the phones rang and got answered. And underneath all of it, like a low structural vibration, was the ongoing fact of the investigation, which consumed enormous amounts of her attention and produced, on most days, very little she could point to. The lead investigator was a woman named Special Agent Carla Denning, compact and direct, who wore the same style of dark blazer in every meeting and had a habit of asking the same question twice, once at the beginning of a conversation and once at the end, as if she wanted to see whether the answer had changed. She'd come to Evelyn's office the Monday after the board meeting, and they'd talked for 3 hours, and Evelyn had given her everything: the access logs, Falk's analysis, Kessler's documents, Victor's personnel history, the Redstone Systems Group connection, the Castleford case. Denning had listened with the practiced attention of someone who was simultaneously evaluating the information and evaluating the person providing it. At the end of the 3 hours, she'd asked, "Is there anything you know that you haven't told me?" "Not that I'm aware of," Evelyn said. "Think about it tonight. I'll ask you again tomorrow." She had thought about it, and the answer the next day was the same, and Denning had accepted that without comment and moved on to Gavin. Gavin had met with Denning twice, once at the Hartwell facility and once at the federal field office downtown, which he'd driven to alone in his truck, parked in the visitor lot, and sat through a 4-hour interview with the particular composure of a man who has been waiting for that exact conversation for 22 years and had long since figured out what he was going to say. Evelyn knew this because Denning had told her the second session went well, and because afterward Gavin had called her and said, in his characteristically compressed way, "It's done. She has everything." "How are you?" Evelyn had asked. A pause. "Tired," he'd said. Which was, she'd come to understand, Gavin's version of a substantial emotional disclosure. The investigation widened faster than she'd expected in some directions and slower in others. Within the first 2 weeks, Denning's team had identified 3 additional individuals with material connections to the scheme, 2 at Redstone Systems Group and 1 at an intermediary consulting firm called Vantage Technical Partners that had, on examination, almost no legitimate clients, and a client list that read like a map of sensitive aerospace programs. The consulting firm had been the mechanism. Intellectual property moved through Vantage, money moved back, and the whole arrangement had been structured with enough layers that untangling it required the kind of forensic accounting that took time and produced paper by the ream. Victor's attorney had entered a not guilty plea and immediately requested a continuance, which was granted, which pushed the preliminary hearing to a date that was 11 weeks out. Evelyn had sat in her office and read the filing and then closed her laptop and gone for a walk around the building, which was something she almost never did, and stood outside in the cold November air for 10 minutes, thinking about nothing specific until she could go back inside and be productive. What she hadn't anticipated, and what turned out to be its own category of difficulty, was the reaction inside the company. The employees learned, in pieces and at different speeds, the way information always moves through an organization regardless of how carefully it's managed. The first wave came from the people who'd been in or near the board meeting. The second wave came when Victor's arrest was reported in an industry newsletter, a brief item, 4 sentences, carefully worded to say as little as possible while confirming the essential facts. The third wave came when 2 more Hartwell employees were called in for federal interviews. Routine information gathering, Denning had told Evelyn, not subjects of the investigation. And the entire avionics software department spent a week in a state of anxious collective hypervigilance that made Evelyn's visits to that floor feel like walking into a room where everyone had just stopped talking. Marcus handled most of the internal communication, which he was good at, but there were things he couldn't handle, and that only Evelyn could. and she did them one by one with the systematic patience that she'd learned. Watching her father was the only way to manage a company in genuine crisis. She met with department heads individually. She sat with the avionics software team in their own conference room for 90 minutes and answered their questions directly, including the ones that didn't have good answers. She stood in front of the full company at an all-hands and said, without excessive decoration, that someone they'd trusted had done serious damage, that the company was cooperating fully with investigators, and that her job and their job was to make sure the aircraft they built were safe, which was the only thing she was asking everyone to focus on. It wasn't an inspiring speech. It wasn't meant to be. She'd seen enough corporate crisis communication to know that inspiration was the wrong register for a moment like this. People didn't need to be rallied, they needed to be leveled with, and she did that. And the effect was not immediate confidence, but something more durable. The specific relief of being told the truth by someone who could have told them less. Priya Okafor had been placed on the investigation's witness list, which she'd taken with the same wired, exhausted composure she'd brought to the maintenance conference room that first Thursday night. Evelyn had pulled her into her office 2 weeks after the board meeting and told her directly that her role in identifying the terminal records had been significant and would be recognized when things were concluded. Priya had looked at her with a slightly skeptical expression. "I just ran the badge log," Priya said. "You ran it when no one asked you to, and you brought it to me instead of your supervisor," Evelyn said. "That's not nothing." Priya thought about that. "Victor was my supervisor's supervisor." "Yes." "So if I'd taken it to my supervisor—" "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "Maybe it would have been fine. Maybe not." Priya sat with that. "I wasn't being brave," she said. "I was just... It seemed like the right person to take it to." "That's usually what being brave looks like," Evelyn said. She called her father on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the arrest. Robert Hart was 74, living in the house in the hills where Evelyn had grown up, with a part-time nurse named Donna, who made better coffee than anyone in the Hartwell office, and had a genuine fondness for old aerospace industry stories. He was not, by his own account, dying. His cardiologist had been clear about that. But the stroke 3 years ago had taken enough from him that he'd stepped away from everything involving sustained cognitive effort, which was most things, and had settled into a life of books and slow mornings and occasionally watching aircraft from the deck when the weather was right. Evelyn drove out herself. She didn't tell him she was coming because he would have told her not to bother, which was not the same as him not wanting her there. He was on the deck when she arrived, wrapped in a jacket that was slightly too large for him now. He'd lost weight since the stroke, not dramatically, but enough that his clothes had a different relationship to his body. He looked at her when she came through the glass door, and he looked at her face, and he put down the book he was holding. "Tell me," he said. She sat down in the chair across from him and told him. All of it, in the order it had happened, without softening the parts that needed to be said plainly. Victor. The code. The 2003 crash, Gavin Mercer, Kessler's documents. She watched her father's face as she talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't get visibly upset. He sat with the jacket around his shoulders and listened, and his face went through things she couldn't fully read. She'd never been fully able to read him, which had been a source of friction between them when she was younger and which she'd made her peace with, more or less. When she finished, they sat for a while. "Victor," he said. Not a question, just the name, held up and looked at. "Victor," she confirmed. "I hired him," her father said. He said it quietly, without drama, but she could hear the weight in it. "Not directly. I approved the hire. He came well recommended from Redstone. I thought..." He stopped. "I thought he was a good engineer who understood the business side. That combination is rarer than people think." "I know." "The 2003 crash." He looked at the view, the valley, the hills going brown in November, the faint smear of an aircraft contrail at altitude. "I was told the investigation was complete. I was told..." He stopped again. There was a concern report. "From Gavin Mercer," she said. "Yes. I saw it." He said it simply. "It came across my desk before the investigation closed. I was told it was being reviewed and that there was no supporting documentation." He paused. "I should have pushed harder on that." "Yes," she said. She didn't soften it. He looked at her. His eyes, which had always been sharp, were still sharp. The stroke had taken his mobility and some of his processing speed, but not, she'd come to think, his essential acuity. "I'm not going to tell you I didn't know anything was wrong," he said. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what. And I was—" He stopped for a long time. "I was managing a lot of things, and the investigation had closed, and I convinced myself that a closed investigation meant the question was answered." He looked at his hands. "I convinced myself." She'd thought about what she would feel in this moment. She'd thought about it the night she'd lain awake going over what Gavin had said. Whether he knew why or who was responsible, I can't tell you. She'd thought she might feel angry. She'd thought she might feel something that was hard to name that lived in the territory between anger and grief. What she actually felt, sitting across from her father on the deck, was tired and sad. And something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite its absence, but was somewhere in the complicated space between them. "Thomas Kessler's family," she said. "I'm going to contact them. When the investigation is further along, they deserve to know." "Yes," he said, "they do." "I wanted you to know that before I do it." He nodded. He looked old, she thought, in a way that had nothing to do with his age. "This Gavin Mercer," he said. "Where is he?" "He's consulting for us, temporarily, helping with the Meridian 7 safety review." "He's been carrying this for 22 years, her father said. That's a long time." "He's a patient man," she said. Her father looked at her for a moment. "Bring him to see me sometime," he said, "if he's willing." She didn't say yes or no to that. She thought it was a request that deserved to go through Gavin, not through her. "I'll ask him," she said. She stayed for dinner. Donna made pasta, and the three of them ate in the kitchen with the overhead light on against the early dark. And her father told a story about a test flight in 1987 that she'd heard twice before but laughed at the right parts of anyway. And afterward she drove home through the hills thinking about the difference between a man who does wrong knowingly and a man who looks away because looking directly is harder, and the way those two things live differently in the body for the rest of a life. The Kessler family took her 2 weeks to locate properly, and another week to find the right way to make contact. She didn't want to call out of nowhere with no preparation, and she didn't want to send a letter that could be misread, and in the end she drove to Wisconsin herself, which was something Marcus had suggested carefully, and she'd rejected and then after 3 days decided was right. Patricia Kessler was 67, retired from teaching, living in the same house outside Racine where Thomas had grown up. She had his eyes. The photograph in the alumni magazine had been enough to establish that, and she had the specific composure of someone who has processed grief so thoroughly over so many years that the sight of a stranger on her porch bringing news about her dead son didn't break her, but landed in her in a way that was visible. Evelyn sat in her living room for 2 hours. She said what she knew. She said what the federal investigation had established. She said that Tom's concern had been real, that his documentation had been real, that the people who dismissed it had been protecting something that deserved no protection. Patricia Kessler listened with her hands folded in her lap. She asked 2 questions, one technical, which Evelyn answered as accurately as she could, and one personal. "The man who kept his notes," she said. "His friend. He's still alive?" "Yes." Does he know Tom's family is—" "He knows I'm here today," Evelyn said. Yes, he knows." Patricia nodded. She looked at the window. "Tom talked about him. Gavin. He called him the most technically honest person he'd ever met. He said working with Gavin was the first time he felt like the engineering actually mattered more than the politics." Evelyn sat with that. "I'd like to write him a letter," Patricia said, "if that's possible." "I'll give you his address," Evelyn said. "I'll ask him first, but I don't think he'll say no." She drove back to the airport in the flat gray Wisconsin November afternoon and sat at the gate waiting for her flight and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not relief, because that felt wrong, and not resolution, because that was too clean. Something more like the recognition that certain things can be put right and certain things can only be acknowledged, and knowing the difference between the two was important. The Meridian 7 safety review took 6 weeks. Gavin worked it from the inside, sitting with Priya and the flight safety team, going through every line of code in the hydraulic controller with the kind of attention that was slower than some people were comfortable with, but that Evelyn had learned to trust completely. He was not a man who moved fast through things that required care. He was a man who understood that moving fast through things that required care was how people died. He found 2 additional anomalies. Minor, neither of them flight critical, both of them suggestive of long-term incremental modification rather than single-targeted intervention. He documented them with the same precision he brought to everything and wrote a report that ran to 31 pages and contained exactly 0 hedged language. Every statement was either a fact or explicitly identified as an inference, and the inferences were labeled as such and supported. Falk reviewed it and told Evelyn it was the best internal avionics software audit he'd seen in 15 years of forensic work. She passed that on to Gavin, who made a sound that wasn't quite dismissal and wasn't quite acknowledgement, and then asked if the flight safety team had reviewed his hydraulic load threshold recommendations because 2 of them had come back with questions, and he wanted to make sure the answers were clear before the recertification process started. She left him to it. Denning came back to her in the 6th week with what she called a preliminary picture, which was federal investigator language for a significant amount of evidence that was still being organized into a prosecutable structure. The picture included Victor Sloan, 2 Redstone Systems Group executives, the principal of Vantage Technical Partners, and a 4th individual, a former Hartwell employee who had left the company in 2018 and whom Evelyn didn't recognize by name until Denning showed her the personnel file and she realized it was someone from the avionics software team, someone she'd seen in the hallway a dozen times without knowing his name. The 2003 crash was part of the federal case. Denning confirmed this without ceremony. It fell under a conspiracy charge that required establishing the pattern of conduct, and the pattern extended back to Kessler and Abrams and the test aircraft. 2 people killed, Denning said, in the matter-of-fact language of federal agents discussing violence, as if the matter-of-factness was a form of professional respect for the seriousness of what had happened. Evelyn had relayed this to Gavin in the parking lot of the maintenance facility on a cold December afternoon, both of them standing in the kind of thin winter sunlight that gives more light than warmth. He'd been holding a thermos, which was apparently a permanent accessory. He'd listened and then looked at the airfield for a while. "They'll actually be charged," he said, "for Tom. That's the intent." He nodded. She watched his face, which was doing something she couldn't fully read. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even grief exactly, but something that lived in all of those and was also its own thing. 22 years is a long time. The end of a 22-year wait doesn't feel the way you expect it to feel, in the same way that arriving somewhere after a very long journey doesn't feel like the journey has been erased. It just means you've stopped. "His sister wrote me," he said. "Patricia?" "Yeah." He looked at the thermos. It was a good letter. She's a good writer." He paused. "I wrote back. Took me about 4 drafts." He said it without embarrassment, which was one of the things Evelyn had come to find consistently disarming about him. He said things that other people would obscure, not because he was unguarded, but because he'd apparently decided that obscuring them took more energy than it was worth. "What did you say?" she asked. I told her the truth about what Tom found and what he thought about it, and what the last conversation I had with him was actually like. He paused. I told her he was right about everything and that I was sorry I couldn't make it count sooner. She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say. The defense contract negotiations resumed in January, which was 3 months after the demonstration flight and roughly 6 weeks after the Meridian 7's recertification process began. General Rudd had maintained a professional distance through the fall, formal communication only, no visits, no off-the-record calls, and Evelyn had respected that, understanding it as the appropriate posture of a man whose oversight responsibilities didn't permit him to be visibly invested in the outcome of a criminal investigation into a company he was potentially contracting with. When he called in January, it was through official channels with a formal meeting request, and when they sat down in a conference room at the defense procurement offices, there were lawyers on both sides and a stenographer in the corner. But Rudd, being Rudd, started the meeting before the official portion began, leaning back in his chair, looking at her across the table, saying, "Tell me where we actually are." "Off the record," she told him. He listened with the same focused attention he'd given everything, and at the end he said, "The mechanic. Mercer. He's still consulting?" "Through the end of the recertification." "And after that?" "That's up to him," she said. Rudd looked at the table for a moment. "We're going to want independent safety oversight as a condition of the contract renewal," he said. "Ongoing, not just recertification." "I expected that. I think it's appropriate. I'm going to want Mercer's name on the safety advisory structure." She looked at him. "He's not a corporate man." "I'm not asking him to be a corporate man. I'm asking him to be the person who knows where the bodies are buried in that aircraft's software, which apparently he literally is." He said it without particular humor. "I want someone in that structure who has demonstrated he'll say what he knows regardless of who's in the room. That's a difficult quality to find, and I'm not inclined to ignore it when I see it." She'd brought this to Gavin that afternoon, not as a directive, but as a thing that had been said by someone whose opinion mattered to the contract, and therefore to the company, and therefore to whether 240 people still had jobs next year. She'd laid it out as plainly as she could, and she'd told him it was his choice. He'd sat with it. "Advisory," he said, "not operational." "Advisory? I'm not moving to an office." "Nobody's asking you to move to an office." He'd looked at her. "I'm still going to say what I think." "Yes," she said. "That's the entire point." He'd made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "All right," he said. "Advisory." The weeks between January and the formal contract signing in March had a different texture than the fall. The investigation was ongoing, but its shape was established, and the company had begun to find its footing in the way that companies do when the acute crisis passes and the longer work of reconstruction begins. Evelyn hired a new COO, an engineer named Sylvia Marsh, who had spent 15 years at a commercial aircraft firm and had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions in budget meetings, which was precisely why Evelyn wanted her. The avionics software team got a new department head and a new code review protocol that required co-signatories on every modification above a certain complexity threshold and an independent safety review for anything touching flight-critical systems. None of these changes were glamorous. They were the kind of structural reforms that don't make good stories because they're preventive rather than dramatic. They're the systems that make the dramatic thing not happen, which means their success is measured in absence rather than presence. Evelyn had explained this at an all-hands in February, and it had landed the way true but unglamorous things generally land, with recognition rather than enthusiasm, which was fine. Gavin attended 2 company-wide meetings during this period, which for a man who had spent 22 years specifically not attending company-wide meetings at Hartwell was its own kind of significant. He sat in the back both times. He didn't say anything unless directly asked. When he was directly asked, once about the recertification timeline and once about the hydraulic load threshold recommendations, he answered without preamble and without softening. And both times the room got slightly quiet in the way rooms get when someone says something true in a way they're not accustomed to hearing. Priya Okafor had been promoted, which Evelyn had done quietly and without making a speech about it, because Priya wasn't someone who wanted a speech. She wanted a title and a salary that matched what she was actually doing. She came to Evelyn's office the day the promotion was announced and said, "I just want to make sure this isn't because of the badge log. It's because you're good at your job, and you've been good at your job for 2 years, and I should have done this sooner," Evelyn said. Priya considered this. "Okay," she said. "That's fine then." She left, and Evelyn noticed that she'd used the same word Gavin always used, and she wasn't sure if that was coincidence or the beginning of a professional vernacular, and either way she found it unreasonably comforting. Dana Ross called in February. The pilot, the Meridian 7's captain on the demonstration flight, had been in contact with Hartwell's legal team since October as a formality of the investigation, but this call was personal, to Evelyn's direct line, and Dana had said simply, "I wanted to say thank you, not to the company, to you for finding who was responsible." "You should say it to Gavin," Evelyn said. "I did," Dana said. He told me I was a good pilot and then asked if I had any technical feedback on the reset procedure he'd walked me through. I gave him the feedback and he said thanks. And that was the end of the conversation. Evelyn had laughed at that. Not a polished, appropriate laugh, but a genuine one that surprised her. "That's about right," she said. "He's a strange man," Dana said. "He's a particular kind of man," Evelyn said. "I've come to think those are different." After she hung up, she sat for a moment thinking about that. Particular. A man who had known when to be patient and when to act, who had held something for 22 years without letting it hollow him out entirely, who had said what he knew in a room full of people who had the power to make his life very difficult and had said it anyway, without drama, without performance, just because it was true and it needed to be said. She thought about what Patricia Kessler had told her, that Tom had said Gavin was the most technically honest person he'd ever met. She thought that was the right description, and she thought it didn't apply only to the technical part. Outside her office window, the afternoon was gray and still, the kind of February day that feels like waiting. The airfield was visible in the middle distance, and a single aircraft was on final approach, its landing lights on against the overcast, coming down in the slow, inevitable geometry of a well-flown approach. Gear down, flaps set, everything where it needed to be. She watched it touch down cleanly and roll out, and she thought about how much work went into making that look simple, and how most of that work was invisible, and how the whole system depended on people who were willing to know what they knew and say so when it mattered. The aircraft turned off the runway and taxied toward the terminal, and Evelyn turned back to her desk. The verdict came on a Thursday in late April, which felt arbitrary until Evelyn thought about it and realized that significant things rarely arrive on days that feel appropriate. They arrive on ordinary days, Thursdays, Tuesdays, mornings when you're in the middle of something else, and the ordinariness of the day is part of what makes them land the way they do. Victor Sloan was found guilty on 7 counts: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, unauthorized access to protected computer systems, obstruction of a federal safety investigation, and 3 counts related to the classified data theft that Denning's team had spent 5 months untangling from the Vantage Technical Partners records. The jury had deliberated for 2.5 days, which the attorney Marcus had retained to monitor the proceedings told Evelyn was neither fast nor slow. It was the deliberation time of people who were being careful, which was what you wanted. The 2 Redstone executives entered guilty pleas the same week as part of a cooperation agreement that Denning had been negotiating since February. The principal of Vantage Technical Partners had pleaded guilty 4 months earlier in December and had been the source of the financial records that had made the conspiracy case as solid as it was. The former Hartwell software employee, his name was Paul Greer, and Evelyn still had trouble connecting the name to the face she'd passed in hallways without registering, pleaded guilty in January and cooperated fully, providing testimony about the specific mechanism by which the software updates had been routed through the administrative authorization track without triggering the safety review chain. What Greer described, and what the full picture of the conspiracy revealed, was not the work of an impulsive man or an opportunist. It was the work of someone who had been patient in the way that only people with very long time horizons can be patient. Victor had spent 9 years as COO building the internal architecture of his own escape route, the process gaps, the authorization structures, the access credentials, in the same methodical way that a person might spend years quietly loosening a bolt they intend to need later. He hadn't taken shortcuts. He hadn't gotten greedy. He had, in the estimation of Denning's team, been within approximately 18 months of completing a scheme that would have destroyed Hartwell's defense standing entirely and cleared the field for Castleford's competing hydraulic architecture to take the contract. 18 months. Evelyn had sat with that number for a long time. 18 months and a mechanic at a regional airfield who had been waiting, with his own particular patience, to make sure that if something happened, someone knew what to look for. The sentencing was scheduled for July. Denning had told her, without making it a promise, that the guideline range for Victor's charges was significant. Evelyn hadn't asked for specifics. She found by the time the verdict came that she was less invested in the particular number of years than she'd expected to be. Victor being convicted was what mattered. The length of the sentence was the court's business, not hers. What she found herself thinking about on the Thursday the verdict came in was Thomas Kessler. She was in her office when Marcus texted her the news from the courthouse, and she read it and sat for a moment and thought about a 26-year-old engineer who had found something in a code base and written it down carefully and told his friend about it, and who had died on a clear morning in 2003 before he was old enough to understand that the thing he'd found would spend 22 years waiting to matter. He hadn't known, in those last days, that his notes were going to be the thing that finally broke it open. He'd just done what an honest engineer does. He documented what he found and told someone he trusted. It occurred to Evelyn, sitting in her office on a Thursday in April, that this was not a small thing. In fact, it was the whole thing. Victor's scheme, for all its patience and sophistication, had been brought down not by anything dramatic, but by the simple, stubborn practice of two engineers who wrote things down and told the truth about what they saw. One of them hadn't lived to see it matter. The other had carried it for more than 2 decades through jobs that didn't use his real abilities, through years of being invisible, through the specific solitude of knowing something important that no one was ready to hear. She called Gavin. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was either near his phone or expecting her call, probably both. "Guilty," she said. A pause, shorter than most of his pauses. "All 7?" "All 7." She heard him exhale. Not dramatically, just the specific sound of breath that has been held for a long time releasing. "Okay," he said. "Gavin." "Yeah." "Are you all right?" A longer pause this time. She'd learned to wait through his pauses, which took some adjustment, because her natural instinct was to fill silence, and his natural instinct was to use it. "I think so," he said. "Ask me again in a week." "I'll ask you again in a week," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to go for a drive," he said. "Okay. I'll be in tomorrow." She didn't tell him he didn't have to be. He knew that. He'd come in because he had work to do on the hydraulic load analysis, and because he was not, at this point in his life, a man who processed things by stopping. He processed them by continuing, which was a coping mechanism with significant drawbacks, and also, she'd come to think, a genuine form of integrity. She hung up and looked out the window at the airfield, and the sky was doing the thing April skies do in that part of the country, alternating between gray and something close to blue, as if it hadn't committed, and she thought about what it meant to be all right. Whether all right was a destination or just a direction, whether you could know the difference from inside it. She drove to see her father that weekend. He was better than he'd been in November. Some color back, the jacket fitting a little less loosely, Donna reporting that he'd been eating properly and had walked to the end of the road and back 3 days running, which for Robert Hart at 74 post-stroke was a meaningful number. He was on the deck again when she arrived, but this time he had the newspaper in addition to a book, which was a sign of improved appetite for the world. She told him about the verdict. He listened, folded the newspaper, and said, "Good." Just that. Good. She understood it. They had lunch and talked about other things. The company's recertification timeline, the contract signing coming up in 3 weeks, a satellite program that Sylvia Marsh had flagged as a potential new direction. Her father asked intelligent questions and offered observations that were, as they generally were, more useful than he made them sound. She'd always suspected he deliberately undersold his own thinking as a conversational courtesy, so that the other person didn't feel lectured, and she'd started doing it herself without realizing it, which was the kind of inheritance that didn't come up in estate planning. After lunch, on the deck with coffee, he said, "Gavin, has he seen the verdict?" "I called him when it came in." "Good." He looked at the hills. "I've thought about what to say to him, if he's willing to come." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not sure there's a right way to say what I want to say." "What do you want to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "That I was wrong not to push harder on that concern report. That it cost something it shouldn't have cost. That I'm sorry for that." He paused. "It's not enough. I know that. But it's true." "Then say it," she said. "He's a man who values true things." Her father looked at her with an expression that was, she thought, pride, though he would not have said so directly because that wasn't how he operated. "You know him well," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said. The contract signing was on a Wednesday in May, which was a better day for significant things than the Thursday the verdict had come on, though Evelyn recognized this was superstition and didn't repeat it to anyone. The signing itself was formal and brief. The documents had been reviewed by multiple sets of lawyers over multiple weeks, and by the time everyone sat down at the table, there was essentially nothing left to negotiate, only to confirm. General Rudd signed across from Evelyn, and his acquisition team signed their portions, and Hartwell's legal team signed theirs, and it was done. Afterward, in the small reception that had been arranged in the conference room adjoining the signing room, catered, modest, the kind of thing Evelyn had been careful to keep from tipping into celebration, because a celebration implied ease, and none of this had been easy, Rudd found her near the window. "The safety oversight structure," he said. "The advisory panel. How's that going?" "First formal meeting is next month. Gavin is on it along with 2 external safety engineers and Priya Okafor from our flight safety team." Rudd nodded. "Good panel." "It's a good panel," she agreed. "He'll be the difficult one," Rudd said. Not as a complaint. "He'll be the honest one," she said, "which will sometimes feel the same." Rudd almost smiled at that. "Tell him I said he did the right thing, out at Creston. He probably doesn't need to hear it from me, but tell him anyway." She told Gavin later that day, relaying it exactly as Rudd had said it. Gavin had been in the maintenance facility going over the final hydraulic load documentation with Priya, and he'd looked up from the papers when Evelyn said it and thought about it for a moment with the specific quality he brought to genuine consideration. Not performing thought, actually doing it. "All right," he said. "Tell him thanks." Priya, without looking up from her portion of the documentation, said, "You could also just be a normal person and feel good about it." Gavin looked at her. "I do feel good about it." "You don't look like it." "This is what feeling good looks like on me," he said, and Priya made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, and Evelyn left them to finish the documentation because they were, she'd come to understand, the right people for it, and they didn't need her in the room. He met Robert Hart in June. Evelyn drove them both out on a Saturday morning, Gavin in the passenger seat, quieter than usual, which was saying something. She didn't try to fill the silence. She'd gotten better at that. Her father was standing on the porch when they pulled up, which meant he'd been watching for them, which he would deny if asked. He looked at Gavin as they came up the walk. A long, direct look. The look of someone who has been preparing for a thing and is now doing it. They shook hands on the porch. Her father said, "I've thought about what to say, and I don't think any of it is adequate." Gavin said, "You don't need to say anything." "I do," her father said. "I knew the concern report existed. I was told it was unsubstantiated, and I accepted that because it was easier to accept. 2 people died, and you spent 22 years carrying something that I had some responsibility for, and I'm sorry." Gavin stood on the porch and looked at Robert Hart for a moment. He looked at him the way he looked at technical problems. Directly, without flinching, taking in what was actually there rather than what he expected. "I believe for a long time that you knew exactly what happened," he said, "that you were part of it." "I know," her father said. "I don't believe that anymore." He paused. "But I also think you're right, that you could have pushed harder, and I think you know that." "Yes," her father said. "I do." They stood there for a moment, 2 men with more than 2 decades of complicated distance between them, standing on a porch on a June morning, doing the thing that people do when there's no clean resolution available, and the only honest option is acknowledgement. It wasn't a reconciliation exactly. It was something more specific and less tidy. 2 people telling the truth to each other about a thing that had cost more than either of them had paid directly, and finding that the telling, while insufficient, was still necessary. They had lunch. It was, improbably, a decent lunch. Her father asked Gavin about the hydraulic load analysis, and Gavin answered in the specific technical register he used when talking to someone he'd assessed as capable of following it, which was itself a form of respect. And her father engaged with it seriously and asked follow-up questions that were sharper than Gavin had expected, which Evelyn could see registering in the slight shift of Gavin's posture. By the end of the meal, they were talking about a problem in the load threshold calculation in a way that had nothing to do with history or justice or 22 years of anything, just 2 engineers looking at a problem and thinking about it. She watched them from the doorway while Donna cleared the lunch plates, and she thought that this was probably not what healing looked like in movies or in stories. It didn't look like anything resolving. It looked like two people finding, against the odds and across a significant amount of damage, a small piece of common ground, and standing on it without making too much of it. That felt right to her. That felt actually more valuable than a clean resolution would have. The Meridian 7 flew again in July. Full recertification, new software build, independent safety verification signed off by Falk and confirmed by the Federal Aviation Oversight Division that had been brought in as part of the contract's new safety structure. Dana Ross was in the left seat for the requalification flight, which she'd requested and been granted, and Kenji Lau was in the right seat, and they took the aircraft up on a clear Tuesday morning over the same airfield where, 9 months earlier, everything had gone wrong. Evelyn watched from the observation deck. Not the same spot as before. She stood slightly closer to the railing this time, which was a small change and probably meaningless, but she noticed it. Gavin was beside her. He'd come without being asked, which was its own kind of statement for a man who generally didn't go places without a specific reason. He had his thermos. He watched the Meridian 7 climb out to the north in the same long arc the demonstration flight had followed, and his face had the quality it sometimes had when he was watching aircraft, a specific concentrated attention that was different from his usual composure, warmer somehow, like the thing he was watching mattered to him in a way that was personal and not purely technical. Which it was, she thought. He'd built the bones of this aircraft, the hydraulic integration architecture, the pressure management logic, the load threshold calculations. His fingerprints were in there, his and Tom Kessler's, underneath everything that had been built on top in the years since. The aircraft flying above them right now was, in some essential way, the work of two engineers in a lab in 2001, one of whom was dead and one of whom was standing on a tarmac with a thermos watching it fly. She thought about what that meant to him. She didn't ask, because she'd learned that there were things Gavin processed by watching and not talking, and this was one of them. She stood beside him and watched the aircraft complete its qualification passes, clean, responsive, the hydraulics behaving exactly as they were supposed to, and let the moment be what it was. The Meridian 7 landed 26 minutes later. Not hard this time. Dana put it down with the precision of a pilot who has had a very strong personal motivation to understand exactly what this aircraft could do and has spent 9 months making sure she knew. The touchdown was smooth, the rollout straight, the turnoff clean. The aircraft taxied back toward the hangar and the ground crew met it and the engines spooled down and the morning went quiet in the way that mornings do after a jet has passed through them. Gavin watched until the aircraft had stopped moving. Then he looked at the airfield for a while longer, at nothing specific, at the runway and the sky and the distance, and Evelyn led him. Tom would have liked to see that, he said finally. Yeah, she said, he would have. They stood there a while. The morning warmed around them. Commercial flight crossed overhead at altitude, too high to hear clearly, just a white line being drawn across the blue. There was something she'd been thinking about saying for weeks, and she'd been holding it because she wasn't sure of the right moment, and she thought the right moment might just be the moment you were in, not some better one that was coming. What I've learned from you, she said, is that honesty isn't a value people perform when it's easy. It's what they do when it costs something. He looked at her sideways. You don't have to say anything, she said. I just wanted to say it. It cost Tom more than it cost me, he said. I know. That's part of what makes what you did matter. She looked at the runway. You could have let it go. After everything. You could have decided that Tom's notes were just old documents and the company wasn't worth it and the world was going to be what it was. Most people would have. Most people wouldn't have waited 18 months at a regional airfield, he said. No, she agreed. They wouldn't have. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not a hero, he said. I want to be clear about that. I spent 22 years not doing enough. I kept the documents, but I didn't fight hard enough when it might have made a difference earlier. I talked myself into believing that waiting was the same as being strategic. He turned the thermos in his hands. Tom didn't get 22 years because I didn't push hard enough in 2003. I have to live with that. She didn't argue with him because he was right, and arguing with true things was something she'd learned to stop doing. You're not a hero, she said, but you did the right thing when it counted. Both of those things are true at the same time. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the sky. Yeah, he said. I know. She thought about the nature of accountability, how it wasn't the same as punishment, though they sometimes overlapped, how it was, at its core, just the practice of seeing clearly and saying so. Victor Sloan had spent 22 years avoiding it, constructing an elaborate infrastructure of deflection and positioning, and in the end, what had brought it down was a dead man's notes and a living man's memory. The whole apparatus of the scheme, the years of careful planning, the layered authorization structures, the patient accumulation of access and influence, had been beaten by documentation and honesty. That wasn't a satisfying action movie truth. It was slower than that. It cost more than that. It required Tom Kessler dying and Gavin Mercer spending 2 decades in a kind of professional exile, and 2 pilots almost not coming home, and a company nearly being destroyed. It required a lot of people doing their jobs carefully in dark and unglamorous ways. Priya pulling badge logs at midnight, Falk reading 1,000 lines of code, Denning asking the same question twice at the beginning and end of every conversation. Nothing about it had been elegant. And yet here was the Meridian 7, airworthy and certified, its hydraulic systems clean and its code verified, flown by pilots who were alive because at a certain moment, a man at a fuel cart had picked up a handheld radio and said what he knew. That was the whole story. A man who knew something said it. That was it. That was enough, and also not nearly enough, and also the only thing that had ever worked. Yeah. Gavin drove back to Creston that afternoon. He'd kept his job there through everything, taken personal days for the meetings, the federal interviews, the advisory panel sessions, and then gone back to the field and done his shift and checked oil levels and ran pressure diagnostics on planes that needed it. Evelyn had offered him more than once to put him on the Hartwell payroll properly, full-time, something with a title and a salary that matched what he was actually contributing, and he'd declined more than once, without drama. I like the work, he'd said. You could do the same work here, she'd said. It's different work. Being someone's employee again, in a formal sense. I don't think I want that. He'd looked at her. The advisory role is enough. The recertification was enough. I don't need an office. She'd pushed once more, and he'd been patient about the pushing, and then she'd stopped because she'd understood, finally, not quickly, that what Gavin was protecting wasn't a lifestyle preference. It was something more specific, the ability to tell the truth without the weight of employment dependency on the other side of it. He'd watched what happened to people who depended on a company for their livelihood when they found something the company didn't want them to find. He'd watched it cost Tom Kessler everything. He wasn't going to put himself back in that structure. Not all the way. Not even for better money and a reasonable employer. That was a rational thing, and also a wounded thing, and she didn't try to argue him out of it. So he went back to Creston. He ran his ground support shifts. He sat on the safety advisory panel one morning a month and said what he thought without softening it, and the panel was, by Rudd's assessment, the most productive safety oversight structure he'd seen in a defense contract in 15 years, which Evelyn relayed to Gavin, who said okay and asked about the agenda for the next meeting. Patricia Kessler came to visit in August. She'd asked Evelyn if she could see the place where Tom had worked, and Evelyn had said yes, of course, and had arranged it carefully. A morning tour of the facility, access to the lab where the Advanced Flight Control Division had been housed before the reorganization, which was now a different department doing different work, but in the same building, the same high-ceilinged space with the same skylights. Patricia had walked through it quietly. She was a composed woman, not brittle, not performing composure, but actually carrying it, the way people do when they've had years to build the particular muscles grief requires. She'd looked at the lab benches and the equipment and the skylights, and she'd been quiet for a while, and then she'd said to Evelyn, "He loved it here. He talked about this building." "I know," Evelyn said, though she hadn't known, not personally. She'd been a college student when Tom was alive. But she'd read enough of his notes by now, the careful, precise handwriting and the margins full of code comments that were funnier than they needed to be, that she felt she knew something about what he'd been. Gavin had come in for Patricia's visit. He hadn't asked whether to come. He'd just shown up, in clean clothes, which for him was a kind of formality. He and Patricia had spent an hour together in a conference room while Evelyn gave them space, and she didn't know exactly what they talked about, because it wasn't hers to know. Afterward, Patricia had looked steadier than when she'd arrived, which seemed like the right direction. When Patricia left, Gavin stood in the parking lot and watched her rental car pull out. And then he stood there a little longer, and Evelyn stood with him without saying anything. And eventually he said, "She's going to be okay." "She's been okay for a long time," Evelyn said. "She's resilient." "Tom was resilient too," he said. "Ran out of time before he could use it." She didn't have an answer for that. Some things didn't have answers. They just had the practice of sitting with them without flinching, which was what he'd been doing for 22 years and what she was learning to do in the ways the past year had required. "Come on," she said. "I'll buy you terrible coffee from the machine." He looked at her. "You have a machine that makes decent coffee now. Sylvia had it changed." "The new one is decent?" "It's not bad," he said. They walked back inside into the building that smelled of hydraulic fluid and machine oil and the particular chemical cleanliness of avionics workbenches. And the afternoon light came through the high windows the way it always did at this hour. And somewhere on the field outside, an aircraft was taxiing for departure, its engine rising through the frequencies as it turned onto the runway, and then the sound of it lifting, crossing overhead, climbing away into the blue. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The aircraft climbed and the sound of it faded, and the afternoon held what it held. All of it, the loss and the reckoning and the slow, imperfect work of building something honest out of what had been broken. And then it was just a Tuesday in August, and they went back to work.